Hey everybody, welcome back to another Cloth Map voice chat. This time we are talking with the one and only Danny O'Dwyer. If you don't know Danny, he is the founder of another video game-centric Patreon video project called Noclip that focuses generally on the nitty-gritty of game development. He's also, as you may be able to tell from his name, a native of Ireland. I've known Danny for many years, but this is really the first chance that I've gotten to talk with him at length about what growing up in Ireland was like. We also get into the various Irish sports that exist, their relationship with England as it pertains to sports and games, and of course the video game industry, which is where we both cut our teeth. As before, if you are a Cloth Map patron, you will have access to this interview as a podcast format. And of course, you get various behind-the-scenes stuff, full resolution downloads, a store discount, etc. If you're not a patron, you can sign up at patreon.com/clothmap. Danny's a great guy, and if you like what he has to say, you can sign up for his project at patreon.com/noclip. So without further ado, please enjoy this voice chat with Danny O'Dwyer. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, sir. We never talk, so it's
we never do. It's so nice to hear your voice. For the small percentage, I guess, of people that don't know, Danny and I do a podcast together on a weekly basis with Rob Zachney about Formula One, which is it's a game of sorts.
It most certainly is. It is it's an international game as well. Yeah, maybe actually there's a way of collaborating Shift F1 and Cloth Map in a way at some stage down the future.
For those people that don't know you and what you do, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. In case the accent or name wasn't a giveaway, I'm an Irish person. I was born in Ireland. My name is Danny. At the moment, I run a company called Noclip that basically makes documentaries about sort of video game development. But prior to that, I worked at GameSpot, which is where I met Drew, because when I moved to America a number of years back, we shared an office with your old place, Giant Bomb. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now.
I'm always curious about people that do the weird work that we do, how they introduce themselves to other people.
Yeah,
like to hear your pitch is really interesting because yours is a lot more straightforward than mine. Mine has a lot of like qualifiers. I think I usually say like I do a.
I'm a YouTuber.
It depends on who I'm talking to, but I usually say, if they're unfamiliar, I just say I have a YouTube channel where I go around to different places and explore the culture through what kinds of games and sports that they play. That's right. My pitch.
Whereas I've realized that the closest thing somebody has to what I do is like behind the scenes features on DVDs. So I just say, hey, do you remember those? I do those, but I put them on YouTube for free. But for games.
but also Patreon.
Yeah. No, I never mention that thing. If a couple of questions down the line, if they ask about it, then I say, oh, it's crowdfunded. And then they either are like, they know what that is, or they're like, I don't know what that is. Let's talk about your Irish stuff instead.
Well, we're here to talk about your Irish stuff because frankly, I've known you for so long. I forget that you have an accent. It's funny. But you, I've never lived in another country.
Right.
So I, whenever I do think about that, I go like, man, like you grew up in, when did you move? You grew up in Ireland, but you moved to, first it was the UK. What's kind of your personal history with that?
Yeah, I moved, and not only did I live in Ireland, I mostly lived in like one town, Waterford in the southeast, which most people don't know unless they've heard about the glass factory, the Crystal that we make. The factory's a lot smaller now than it used to be. We could talk about economics in Ireland until the cows come home. But I went to college in my hometown, university. I was there until I was, I think, 22 or 23, I guess. And then I moved to Cork in the southwest for a year, worked in retail. And then, I tried to find my fame and fortune abroad, as so many Irish people do, and went to the UK. I guess it was, I moved to London, I think it would have been like 2008, maybe. To basically to try and find a job in the video games press, because there kind of was none in Ireland. And that's kind of the way a lot of lot of different. It's different for every generation, but we're definitely a country of immigrants. Or immigrants, depending on what side of the equation you are. So like lots of my friends, for instance, right after I left, there was a pretty bad financial crisis. Housing market collapsed, and a lot of my friends, especially those who worked in trades, ended up leaving pretty quickly. So I have a lot of buddies who are plumbers and carpenters who live in Australia now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's your choices are, they're limited to the realities of visas and whatnot, and also the realities of what languages you speak. So for Irish people, it tends to be England, because it's regardless of the EU thing, we actually have a special relationship with them anyway. So even when they leave Brexit, Irish people will be able to move with the same freedom as we can right now. And then outside of that, it's countries with less stringent visa requirements, which for Irish people is generally Australia, and then kind of Canada is kind of the next one for English speaking anyway.
Okay. Generally, are visas hard to get for Irish people, or does everyone like Irish people?
I mean, it depends on the country, but like generally visas are hard to get.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, like American ones, for instance, are next to impossible unless you've got a company vouching for you, or you've done like a marriage thing or something like that. Of which I have done both, so I can talk to you about both of those. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, inside of the Eurozone, freedom of movement makes all of those things very easy. You can move to another country in Europe or within the EU with relatively low amount of paperwork. Obviously, the financial costs of moving is strenuous on a lot of people, and generally you need to be sort of have some money saved or be somewhat middle class to be able to pull it off. But outside of the EU, it's definitely a country by country situation. Like you can move to countries in North Africa, for instance, not too difficult. Many countries in the Middle East, for instance, would require work visas for you to live there. Sometimes the work visas and residence visas are tied up in the same thing. And then it's kind of. It depends then. I don't want to make too broad of a claim, but like the delineation would seem to be whether or not you're an emerging economy or a sort of established economy at that stage. But yeah, it's different for each country, and it's always changing as well.
Yeah. So you grew up playing video games, loving video games, and I mean, getting a job in that industry, you're an outlier anywhere, but would you say that were your interests common among your peer group and people in general? Yeah,
games are really, really popular in Ireland.
Okay.
I think it always... I found it funny when I was, for instance, when I moved to the US and I was working with GameSpot US, that they found it interesting that so much of the traffic came from Ireland for the web traffic. And I know the same is the case on Giant Bomb as well. Because it's a fairly small country, like we're still floating around like 4.5 million people. If you just talk about the Republic, not the North, which generally gets pooled obviously with the UK in terms of population. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one, we're a very externally looking country. It's a small country. We have a really strong sense of national identity. So things that are other are very apparent, because generally they geographically are outside of our borders, or they're very, England feels very other when you've grown up in Ireland and you've never left Ireland, or you've barely left Ireland. It feels like a whole other planet. Now that I've grown up, or now that I've left, it doesn't seem like the case. But the sort of general mentality of Ireland is that there's a lot of interesting flavors out there, and we sort of like to pull them in and consume as much of them as possible. And that goes for our music, television, film, literature, all that stuff, games as well. Another aspect is that our culture is very tied up in storytelling. Our language is... lots of idioms and stuff that exist in other languages or English and stuff come from Irish sayings, which literally mean that thing, not like it's a turn of phrase.
Yeah, you've told me a couple of them.
Yeah, there's loads of, galore means a lot of something, galore in Irish, or smithereens is like tiny pieces. Schmidder means piece, and Ian is like a thing for that. And then there's like lots of like phrases like, God, I
Thanks a million?
Thanks, Kate Mila Fáilte, or that's 100,000. Yeah, thanks a million, I guess, is from that, but Mila meaning thousand, not million, but that's how things get anglicized. There's a whole thing about how Irish words were changed into English facsimiles by the English so that they could kind of destroy our culture and also make it easier for them to say the places. Like Dublin, for instance. Dublin, in Irish, now it's called Baile Átha Cliath, which I actually don't know what it means. Baile is town, but I'm not sure what Átha Cliath is. But Dublin was, I guess it was called Blackpool by the English at some stage, because dove is black and Lynn is pool. So there's a really good Flann O'Brien play called Translations, which kind of goes into, it's about two English guys touring the country and renaming everything. It's why there's a million places in Ireland that are just called Kill, because it's just village.
Oh wow.
Yeah. But outside of that, like our culture and the way we speak and the way we communicate with each other is very wrapped up in storytelling, and it's something I didn't really notice until I left and realized that that's not the way most people communicate. So we're also really interested in consuming stories that way. So, and sharing stories, it's kind of, a big part of how we communicate. And then the other thing, I guess, that sort of adds to this is that as we sort of emerged, Ireland has like come a long way in a very short amount of time. Like none of my parents didn't go to college or anything. Like none of their generation went to college. Like I was the first generation, or like my sisters, or that like was really a lot of people going to university or having any third level education. Like my grandmother finished school when she was 13. Like there was no more school.
Right.
That's when you went to work. So like the culture has, like, the place has irrevocably changed since we got independence, and also then just since we sort of got in control of our own culture and finance and exporting and deciding our own sort of I guess vision for what the country wanted to be. And then once I guess like when the Celtic Tiger kicked in, which was like we had a bad recession in the 80s, and then in the 90s we kind of emerged onto the European market, and that allowed people to buy things like televisions and buy things like computers and import things, because there are certain countries within Europe which have sort of suffered this whole thing. Like Poland, for instance, I went over to interview them about The Witcher recently, or a couple of years back actually now, and they had a similar issue where like when you're using a different currency, which we were for the longest time, and you're using and you're an island, so it's hard to get things to you.
Yeah.
It's everything costs a lot of money. Or I guess when you're in Brazil, they have the same problem. They have a big import tax on electronics, right? So like those types of things create, barriers, but then they also create like passionate people who are involved in those.
Who
and
really
I guess
want to get that stuff.
Totally.
Stop at nothing to do it.
And that's what happened in the early 90s. And then as we sort of emerged, I think it was like the PlayStation, I think was the big one, where suddenly a lot of Irish people had money and they could buy a PlayStation for their kid at Christmas or something, and I think it was the PlayStation 2 where we had the second highest number of PS2s per capita in the world. The only folks who had more were the Japanese.
Wow.
Yeah. So, Island nations, man. We love playing video games.
Can you give some, I mean, you've already talked a lot about the history of that island nation, but I'm always interested in particularly countries that have had a sort of turbulent time in the last 100 years or so. How does that manifest in, it's the people in its society? Like, do you think about that kind of stuff? Where does it show up for you?
I think I talk about this a lot with my wife, and also whenever I meet a European in America, because the mentality of I think it's a fairly European universal thing. Obviously people have their own political views and personal views and all that sort of stuff. But I generally feel that countries that have gone through any sort of like, I don't know, like strife, or I don't necessarily think it has much to do or is totally tied up in actual like war or violence necessarily. And I certainly can't speak for people in the north. I grew up in the southeast of Ireland, so I was very far away from the troubles when they were going on. But I think when that's going on, or when things are changing very fast, and countries start looking inward and looking at where they are and who they are and how they want to be different. I think in Europe, especially with all of this stuff, you kind of understand that it's a very complex, ever-shifting thing, and that all of this stuff has happened before, and that there are lessons to be learned from things that worked, things that didn't work. And it gives you, I think, overall more of a less sureness that you have the answer, but that perhaps your answer to it is one of a number of different answers which are valuable. Whereas over here, I think, and it might have something to do with sort of the way in which the political two-party thing is set up, or it might have something to do with maybe that's actually a symptom of the original thing. But I think I've realized how much history we can pull from, and we do in our, not just recent history, but also like going way further back, that we pull into our day to day in the way we see the world. Whereas over here, because of the freshness of this country, I think that things are often simplified into these sort of like, into morals and values. My sister was over recently and she was like, what's up with all these American products that have like values as brand names? And I was like, what? She was like, yeah, there was like something that was just like, what was it? It was like proud was one of them, was like a thing, or there was like a detergent or something we had that had a name that was like, it was a value. And I was like, oh, I never noticed that before. But yeah, that is like kind of strange. But I think that's a big part of the way Irish people think, is that like, people might have different opinions on things, and especially in relation to the sort of like what was going on in the north and continues to go on. And it's obviously not nearly as bad and out in the open as it was before, but especially sadly in the last couple of months, a lot of the sort of more nasty elements that we tried to leave in the past have sort of come up again. But I think the idea of finding everyone putting down their stakes for the betterment of everyone. I think that was a big part of Irish mentality. And then when you look, and I think Europeans in general feel that way, which is why, de-escalation is a really important part of day to day. Whereas over here, I almost feel like people try and escalate things so that then you can find a winner when the fight happens, which is kind of, I think, the opposite way of the way a lot of people deal. Although Brexit is literally doing the opposite. So I who fucking knows what they're doing at the moment.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the strong Irish identity. Does Ireland have like Irish specific games?
Oh yeah, I mean, in terms of, can we talk about sports?
Yeah, please.
Oh yeah, well we have two domestic sports which are fascinating, and I give any opportunity I have to talk about them, I'm super happy to. One is called hurling, and the other one is called Gaelic football. People tend to know hurling more than Gaelic. Do you know either of them?
You told me about hurling once, and I looked up a picture, and is it like field hockey?
It's probably closest to something like field hockey, but maybe the speed of like a lacrosse, maybe.
Okay.
So it's the fastest field sport in the world. It's played entirely by amateurs. It's 15 on 15. And they're, in a sort of at the highest level in Ireland, it's played by all of the counties in the country have their own team, and they all play each other. So the easiest way to describe it is imagine a soccer goal, or I guess in American football, what would you call them? What do you call them again?
The goalposts?
Goalposts with but you have a bar, right?
Yeah.
So imagine the underside of the bar, there was a net like a soccer thing. And then you have a goalie, a goaltender sitting in there. If you get it through the bar posts, through the bars, above
the uprights?
Above, the uprights, you get 1 point. And if you get it in the goal, you get a goal, which is worth 3 points.
Okay.
And almost all of that is universal between Gaelic football and hurling. They're still 15 on 15, same scoring system.
Oh,
all that
wow.
Sort of stuff.
All right.
Yeah. You pay 35 minutes a half in both of them. Except Gaelic football is played with like a soccer ball, but you can only like run. It's kind of, I think it's supposed to be 3 steps, but really it ends up usually being more like 5. You can only run like 3 steps without like releasing the ball from your hands and kicking it back up to you, or
so
bouncing
you're carrying
it.
the ball.
You're carrying the ball. Yeah.
Okay. So it's like rugby, but it's a sphere.
It's like rugby, except it's a sphere, and the moving is more like basketball, where you have to keep bouncing it, or there's no traveling call, but like you'll get caught for.
There isn't in basketball either. Don't worry.
Yeah, so it's very similar. It's like the rule is elastic depending on the situation.
Yeah.
But it's awesome, and it's like I grew up. My dad played when he was a kid. He ended up being like the chairman of one of the biggest clubs in our hometown. I went to All Ireland finals as a kid. We have a 90,000 seater stadium where these games are played, called Croke Park, and it's entirely amateur. Just to remind you. And like that has its own history of the English tried to sort of there was a couple of things that were like illegal, like speaking Irish, for instance, was illegal for a long time, but people taught it in secret, and when we got our independence it became part of the national curriculum, so you have to do it until you go to college. And then one of the other elements that they tried to sort of stop was our domestic games, and the organization, the GAA, which was set up sort of to keep the sport alive, but also as a sort of almost an affront to the sort of the policies of the English to try and get rid of this stuff. And then, that sort of stuff, it laxed obviously over time. But there were instances, for instance, there was an All-Ireland final right around the time of the Rising, where an English tank drove onto the field and fired into the crowd.
Whoa. So
like there's a lot of like national pride, but it's not that nasty nationalism. It's like a very there was a. Sorry if I'm rambling, but there's one really interesting thing that happened a couple of years ago in relation to this. You mentioned rugby. So Ireland, interestingly enough, it's the only sport, probably because it's like historically would have been a Protestant sport, it's the only sport that the island of Ireland plays as one team. So the Republic and the Northern Ireland, which is its own separate country, part of the United Kingdom, we play as a unified country, and we have They do two national anthems. One is the sort of Republic national anthem, and another one is called Ireland's Call. It's just sort of a general national anthem. And the Irish soccer stadium was where they played a lot of their games, but it was getting refurbished. It's since been rebuilt as the Aviva. It used to be called Lansdowne Road. And so the rugby team didn't have a field, and they play every year in this amazing game tournament called the Six Nations, which involves Ireland, Wales, Scotland, England, France and Italy, who all sort of play each other once in a league format in rugby, and then the winner, it's a really big thing. It happens every year. It's awesome. So it came around and Ireland didn't have a stadium. So there was a massive national debate over whether they should use Croke Park, because it had been really recently refurbished. It was amazing. But the problem being that the English our game against England was in Ireland. So if it was going to happen, we were going to invite the English to play. And this wasn't so much it wasn't that people were overly sensitive. Literally the last time Ireland and England played a game in Ireland, I think I was maybe 7 or 8, and it was in soccer, and it was in Lansdowne Road, and we went 1-0 up, and the English fans, who were, at this stage we now sort of recognise at that stage, were not normal English fans, they were football hooligans and right-wing nut jobs. They basically start pulling up the seats and throwing them on the Irish spectators underneath them. There's a live broadcast. I remember like being a child and running into my bedroom crying because they abandoned the game and all these Irish people were stuck in the stadium getting like pelted on by the English fans. Jeez. The English fans subsequently came out. They were basically hurried into a ferry, beaten up by the Irish police, arrived in Wales, beaten up by the English police, and then banned from going to any sports for life, basically. But we hadn't played in anything since. So eventually the whole like thing, it came to a head, and the GAA did a vote with their committee, and it passed. We played the first game against France and we lost, and then the English game was coming up. Nobody cared about the France game. It was like, what's going to happen when England come? Mm-hmm. They're going to sing God Save the Queen. You know what I mean? And like everyone was saying, like the last time the English were on the field, they killed a bunch of people. Like it was that type of thing, right?
Yeah.
My dad went to the game. I remember watching it on television. I'm gonna get choked up even talking about it now. But the national anthems got sung, both of them. Everyone was like pelting them out, just like all the players were in tears. My dad said it's just like a bunch of old men and women, I'm sure, and like little people, but it was like everyone was kind of just singing it and screaming it, and like it was unbelievable. On the commentators were crying, it was crazy. And then God Save the Queen played, and in rugby, whenever somebody goes for, I guess it would be called a field goal in American football. Where you're basically going for a penalty, you're going to kick the ball between the posts. The whole stadium goes silent, even the away fans. It's like you'd never see it in another sport. I feel like it's like just sacred ground. When someone's kicking the ball, silent.
Wow, like
doesn't
golf.
matter if it's 10,000 people, like golf, exactly like golf. Nobody says "You're a tiger," right as after. God Save the Queen. Irish people quiet. English fans gave it gusto. My dad said there was a guy maybe 5 or 6 rows in front of him who started booing. The guy behind him punched him in the back of the head.
Wow.
They were like, no, we're not. Like, this is as important to us singing our anthem at this sport. It's as important for us to say what happened what happened in the past is in the past. We're meeting you here as equals. And then we kicked the shit out of them. We kicked the shit out of them. We bet them by like 18 points or something. It was fucking brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. And everyone shook hands afterwards, and it's probably like one of the proudest moments of my life. But Irish identity and sport are just like, it's completely intertwined. It's a different conversation kind of to the way we play games, because we don't really have our own video game culture necessarily. But it's a huge part of the Irish identity. Yeah.
There are a number of game developers there, aren't there?
Yeah, there are a bunch, mostly indies. I mean, John Romero lives there as well. He's kind of an indie as well. Him and his wife Brenda Braithwaite. She's credited on for years, but before she got married to John, she was then and still is now an incredible video game designer. They came over, I think, to trace their heritage and fell in love with the place, so they moved over with I think they have 4 kids. And we have historically developers who were born in Ireland who left, like the same way I left to work in the games press. There was a lot of Irish, like Dave Perry from Shiny, for instance, is from, well, he's not Shiny anymore now. Then he was Gaikai. Does he work for Sony now? I don't know what he's doing, but made Earthworm Jim and MDK and all those games. He's from the north. I think he's from Lisburn. Sean Murray from Hello Games is from one town over from where I live, Dungarvan. It's about maybe a 20-minute drive from where I grew up. There's a great little indie scene there at the moment. There's an organization called Immert, which I don't know what it stands for, but Immert in Irish I think means play. But they're sort of a crowd who are basically trying to keep talent within Ireland. So some games like Guild of Dungeoneering, which was popular a couple of years back, was made there. So there's definitely like a lot of Irish people who program. It's just that a lot of them work in software engineering in Dublin, because there's a lot of big tech companies there, or they work in they went to England or something like that. But we're a very technologically educated workforce.
Interesting. It's kind of the reverse of Brazil, because you get a lot of Brazilians who are really good artists, but not a lot of programmers that want to focus just on games. And so you get these cosmopolitan teams of Brazilian artists working with a programmer in Canada.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I think there's a good mix back home. It's a pretty easy place to be an artist. Like I have friends who are painters and like full time, and photographers and musicians. Like it's the cost of living outside of Dublin. Dublin's a nightmare to rent in. Always has been and continues to be. But outside of that, it's pretty easy to be a starving artist. Kind of. I don't want to reduce it to that. It's not easy, sure, but it's more capable, let's say, than a lot of other places. In sort of in healthy economies, shall we say. But yeah, we there was a big push for engineers. I mean, like engineers in terms of not in terms of software, like engineers.
Okay.
In the late 90s into the aughts, and then the big push for my generation was definitely, my brother did computer science, I did multimedia applications development, so I was mostly doing coding and a bit of creative stuff on the side as well. I have a bunch of buddies. One of my best mates, Dale, works for a big software team in Dublin, and yeah, loads of them do.
Do you think, Brexit is going to have an effect? In terms of game companies, do you see more moving to Ireland?
I don't know. That's actually very interesting. One of the big question marks is whether or not Ireland will, take some of the industry that's in the UK. It affects us in lots of ways. I mean, aside from the border stuff, which is probably a whole other conversation, a decent amount of Irish exports would have traditionally gone to the UK. Actually, what's been happening over the past couple of years in preparation of this is that we've scaled back on that pretty drastically and found other markets. I think it was more a relationship of convenience, perhaps, than maybe something we needed. And also a lot of English products are very, very popular in Ireland as well, because we're one of the few. We're one of the few English-speaking, culturally similar nations that also operates within the Eurozone. So we're a pretty handy place to sell to for a lot of companies, as opposed to when you're selling to France, you have to do quite a lot of work to, depending on the product, but to, translate stuff and work within their guidelines and whatnot. A lot of Irish law is actually sort of copy-pasted from British law when we found our independence. So I think it'll hurt everyone. The issue, I guess, being the access to the Eurozone. And I'm no expert on this sort of stuff. I studied economics until I went to college, and I ran a business in Ireland, the UK, and in America. So I'm no expert at all, but I have a decent, I'm confident enough speaking about this stuff. But I think, the issue is going to be access to the Eurozone. But I think the worry is that the knock-on effect of what happens in England is going to be, or in the UK, is going to be so detrimental to the British economy that companies aren't going to be in a position to do that type of relocation. It's going to be a more fundamental problem that'll sort of impact several aspects of their business. So it doesn't look like we're getting much of the financial sector. There was, word at one stage whether or not some of the City of London and Liverpool Street and Canary Wharf's financial business would move abroad, and if it would, where it would go. And Dublin was one spot, and I think Berlin was another area that people thought it might go to. I'm not really sure where that one's ended up. It's kind of a sit and wait and see. I think Irish people generally are more worried about how it'll affect us as we are now, rather than, Dublin's full. Our biggest problem right now, I think, and I say this as somebody who hasn't lived there in almost a decade, is decentralization. Dublin is so expensive, and half the country lives there, and the rest of the country is kind of evenly distributed. There was an episode of that Bear Grylls show where he dropped into a part of Clare, a place called the Burren. It's the biggest limestone area in the world. And he landed, and it was I gotta find somewhere to get some food. If you fucking land anywhere in Ireland, north, south, east, or west, you are within 5 miles of either a farm or a pub, and probably both. So it's fairly well distributed. But I think it's a big question mark hanging over everything. I just hope the stuff in the north is okay more than anything else, really. Yeah.
Well, speaking of working, how did you find coming to America and working in the games industry?
I was super excited to come here because the games press is basically in San Francisco. In Europe, it's dotted around all over the place. There's not really much in Ireland at all, but London is pretty much the hub for English-speaking Europeans. And then there's a big fall-off again. It's not it's very different there because that you're speaking English and it's not the default language, because there's you go to Gamescom and there's all these other outlets with millions of viewers who you've never heard of, right? Or you never go to Jeux Video or whatever. I really loved it. There are aspects of any country I've moved to, be it the UK or America, that I love. There are parts that are different to me and parts I don't like, but yeah, I think the games industry in America is a really cool community of people, which is surprising to me because they're so spread out. I think there's like the unifying factor. I'm not sure if it's like all the conferences that are on, or, you know, the fact that everyone's kind of like in this weird siloed industry, because it's still, games are still like an industry that you don't really fall into. Like film in many ways and television, there are aspects of those jobs like production, or, you know, setting up staging, or like, you know, props or clothing and stuff. There are elements of it that like you can sort of transfer from a different types of creative arts. Whereas if you work in games, if you're working in games, it's because you wanted to work in games. Mm-hmm. So I was surprised when I came over here, given the scale of the country, which of course felt really big to me, being from an island which is smaller than most of your states. And in England, isn't like the UK is not really that much bigger than Ireland. It's like maybe twice as big. I found that really cool, that like everyone's kind of, I don't know, there's a community feel, even though everyone's so spread out.
Yeah. And so what made you want to start Noclip?
I guess like there was a couple of different factors. I guess creative independence is always really important to me. You know, I was freelancer in Ireland. My first company I ran when I was like 15. I was making websites in my hometown, and I moved to London and I worked freelance basically for the first 2 years before I found the job with GameSpot UK, and then eventually made the transfer to GameSpot in San Francisco. So I guess I've always had like I think it's an immigrant's mentality or something, to sort of forge your own path and not wait for one to appear for you or something. I'm also probably a nightmare to work with, so it's you know, that was definitely one thing that I felt when I moved to the UK. When I moved to San Francisco, Ben Howard is the head of games over at CBS Interactive, and he was my boss's boss in GameSpot UK, and he was also an Arsenal fan. We were the only Arsenal fans. We go to games together and chat and stuff, and I always got on really well with Ben. But I remember you know, he was saying like, him and my boss actually at the time, Chris, was saying like, you have to like tone down the Irish, because like even in the UK, like we're fairly like I don't know it's not combative, but like we argue you know, with confidence, and we're loud, and that's okay, and like, mm-hmm. I'm happy for the other person to be the same way, and then, you know, all is forgiven, everyone hugs, you know, there's nothing hard taken about it. But in the UK, especially in London, we're a little bit softer, so it was kind of, I had to like tone it down a little bit. But they were like, you're gonna go to California, like they are I mean, you grew up there, so it's mm-hmm. like to me at least, people are very conflict averse when it comes to yes. like solutions. And I'm not saying Irish people I'm not saying that's a good way of doing it, because that has its own problems, because the loudest person in the room gets their way a lot of the time. But that was like a big clash, I think, when I got there, even when I tried to tone it down, because creatively I like the clash. I like getting angry and having another person get
intellectual, you know, sparring.
Totally. I love it to bits. So I think that was another part of it where like maybe I didn't fit in as well at GameSpot as I thought, or at least I knew that in like a couple of years I'd be kind of a bit sick of it. So yeah, it was that, and then just I wanted to do this type of work for a long time. Like interviewing developers was always one of my favorite things, and I felt like there was a massive missed opportunity in how to do it. Developer interviews never trafficked, and for the sites that were doing that stuff, I think they always thought of it as a content problem, and I always thought of it as a production problem. I thought like, oh, there's good stuff here, it's just you're making it boring. So that was kind of the impetus behind it. And then, you know, the big issue for me as an immigrant was being able to legitimately do it. And I was going through the green card process through CBS, but it was going to take another, I think, 3 years or something at that stage. And I'd recently gotten married, so I ended up costing it, and I was like, oh, it'll cost like it'll cost a bit, but if I did it right now with my own lawyer, we could kind of get this wrapped up maybe in like 3 months,
wow.
which was a lot easier. And then just see if I can set up a business. And I think I was like, I didn't have the green card all that long, and then I set up that wasn't even an LLC, but just I went off on my own and did the thing.
When you start a new project for Noclip, what are like the core tenets? What are you making sure that you get across in the work?
I think the sort of guiding tenet of a lot of the work is to try and like create a sense of understanding and empathy between the developer and the player, to sort of cut out the middle person, as it were. I think the biggest thing that I learned from going to studios when I worked at GameSpot and since then is that there's the language of game creation is like, it kind of reminds me of like, what's that fake Latin language? The one like, what's it called again? Esperanto, right? It's like simple to understand, right? It's like relatively simple. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like that instead of learning Spanish, where like game developers are talking in this very complex language over here. And then gamers are kind of playing in this language over here. And for them to communicate, we've created like this fake language that like they're talking down to be able to like make their complex things understandable. And then gamers are kind of like meeting them in the middle or something.
Yeah. And maybe misappropriating some technical terms that are not real.
Totally. like it's, I'm
just
trying to
optimize your game better.
Right. It's all that sort of stuff. Yeah. And it's like, and in it's all lost in translation. And what's happened is that I think the players have a grasp of that language. So everyone feels like they kind of get a lot of how games are made. But like, actually, it's not really how games are made. So you have the situation where I think game players think they really get it, and they're actually talking about it in like the worst terms. And those terms have kind of been taught to them by, it's just like a natural way it was going to happen. Like I get it. And the media sort of enforced it, and we came up with these rules, and then the media talks with authority using those words, and it ends up being self-perpetuating. So I guess what I tried to do is like try and take all the most complex ideas that we can handle and then have them break it down in a way where the gamer at the end of the day kind of gets it, and not because they understood it before and it got clarified, but because we've like retold them how things work. So I think that's it. And then also the other part is just like to communicate the humanity at the other end, because rightfully in many ways and wrongly in others, we tend to think of game companies as corporate entities that don't serve our best interests, which is a completely legitimate way of thinking about it. The way in which gamers, for instance, talk about Call of Duty, created by a large multinational corporation, and their favorite indie game, for instance, made by 5 people who they know, is apples and oranges. It's completely different. So it's a way of trying to, without trying to be a corporate apologist, trying to facilitate some sort of understanding between game players and everyone who's like working creatively on outside of creatively, just working on the creation of games, which is a real difficult line to dance on, because you can stumble into being an apologist for large companies, or at worst basically making de facto marketing material. And I think over the past 2.5 years I've tried to scatter the types of projects we've done as wide as possible, and sometimes I think we've probably stepped over the line, but stepped close to it a little bit. So it's been a big learning experience, but I think I wouldn't enjoy it if I didn't think there was a degree of creative risk involved in it or something.
Yeah, certainly. What sort of, are there common themes that you're going on 3 years here. What have you Yikes, like? Yeah. Have you learned anything show up?
Like common themes throughout like a lot of the work?
I guess throughout, maybe the people, anything stand out with the people that you talk to about their work, or that maybe you didn't expect or you were surprised by?
I think almost everyone involved in the creation of games is like working their asses off for long periods of time. And I think that's a part of it that I really empathize with people on, because I used to work as a web developer, and like project timelines on web dev were like too long for me, and they were in the months. Project timelines on video are 20% maybe of the length that they are on web development stuff. And when you put the video on YouTube, it's there. That's it. Whereas every website you make is another sort of weight strapped onto your belt that you have to worry about for the next, infinity years and keep working. Forever. Totally. Which,
like a game.
Absolutely. So I think for games, you got people working on a game for years and years, and then they put it out, and then especially for these live games, it's an incredible amount of work. And I think that's been, I don't think I was surprised by that, but I think I was surprised by how it literally kind of affects everyone, like down to the person who's like running HR for the company. Like everyone's always has to be on the top of their game, and the audience is incredibly critical of it. So when we did the Fallout 76 stuff, for instance, like that game has been panned by critics, and there was a large vocal group on the internet rallying against it. How successful it is or isn't, I think it probably is still very successful. I think we read the tea leaves on that stuff very wrong whenever we did a documentary on Warframe, which is a game that most people forgot about, but it's been one of the most popular free-to-play games, the most successful and financially successful games of recent memory. And I think that happens a lot. But I think what's heartbreaking to me is that those people were working their asses off, even if they didn't get it right, even if they got 50% of that game right, they still had to bust their ass for all 100% of it.
Yeah. And there are people on that team who got their job 100% right.
Yeah, totally. There's, and I think you only have to get it a little bit wrong for it all to go wrong, especially today where game players are, pretty demanding, rightfully or wrongfully. I don't honestly know. But I think the watermark for quality is pretty high, especially with established franchises. Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of it, is just how hard people work. And I've definitely softened. I used to have an op-ed show where I'd say, this is what I think games should do, or the design in this game is X. And what I've kind of realized is they know. They know. They tried to do it that way, or they didn't have the money to do it, or the time, or they did it that way and it actually didn't work. But, it's easier for me to say it because it's hypothetical. So it's weird. I've almost stopped watching even critical assessments of games, because I know now all I do is interview devs and they're like, yeah, well, this, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess it's not always so simple.
Yeah. So you've talked to a lot of developers. What do you feel like is coming for the games industry? Not necessarily in game innovation, but as an industry, do you feel any sea changes?
I think the big one that's on the tip of everyone's tongue right now is just workers' rights, and sort of where that one's going to land. And I think it's different on a nation by nation basis as well. A good example of this is, just broadly for anyone who doesn't know, there's kind of a pretty significant conversation going on right now about the way in which developers are treated, and also the sort of requirements of the work. And I talked about how hard people are working, problems like crunch, where folks are contracted to work 40-hour weeks but are doing 100-hour weeks, or big part of it is, which I certainly empathize with as somebody who's moved city, God knows, I don't know how many times, half a dozen times at this stage of my life, is the transient nature of the work. Whereas if you lose a job in Hollywood, you still live in Hollywood. But if you lose a job in games, the stuff is pretty spread out, and it's the more difficult it get. The older you get, you have a family or anything like that, it becomes really, really difficult. And we're losing a lot of talent that way. And there's all talks about things like unionization and stuff like that. But a good example of how this sort of changes on a country by country basis is recently there was two kind of big high profile layoffs. One was with Electronic Arts, or EA, I guess they don't call themselves anymore, EA, and the other one was Activision Blizzard. When the Activision Blizzard layoffs happened, one of the studios affected was based in Anaheim, just south of Los Angeles, and they were California is an at-will employment state, which means that they can basically anyone could fire you at any stage without actually having to give just cause for it. Most of those people were let go didn't have any their benefits were running out pretty quickly, and I do believe most of them didn't get any severance or anything like that. For instance, the same thing happened to Activision employees in France, but because of the ways in which European law is set up, and because I believe that a lot of that staff was unionized as well, they were, I believe, given something like 4 to 6 weeks of heads up that it was happening. And there were policies put in place. There was severance and also policies for getting jobs somewhere else within the organization, which I think is required. And then also something to help them find work outside of the company. So, like, I know from working in Ireland and working in the UK and working in America that this stuff is different on a country by country basis, and it appears to be also on a state by state basis here as well. And I think that's from the lens that I view games now, which is kind of through developers, or at least involves developers. I think that's going to be a massive thing, and then that's going to like maybe change the way games are priced or the way games are like created. Like all these live games that are making a lot of money, like Fortnite or Apex Legends, you know, it recently broke the story about how a lot of the Epic employees are, you know, working crazy hours. Like I've been hearing that for months. Like that's a known thing within the industry, that like all those folks in Raleigh are working their asses off. And a lot of them are doing it thinking, you know what, I'm going to get my next bonus check and get out of here. Whereas I also know that the folks who are making Apex Legends aren't crunching that hard, but they're also still like working pretty hard to try and keep that thing up to date as well. But they're trying not to scale up as big as Epic, I believe, and also try and keep the crunch as minimum as possible. But they're also still crunching in their own way. So I think maybe that means that games get updated less, or maybe that means that, you know, the types of games that are made are not, you know, they changed, less online services perhaps, or different types of online games. But I do think that that's been on the tip of everyone's tongue for a while now, and I think that it's only going to be more of a factor within the changing face of games over the next year or two.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that we know, and a lot of us love about the game industry, is that it's changing all of the time. It is never static.
It's totally like, even since we both started doing this stuff, it's like, it's even like the way in which I feel like Noclip has to tackle this has to change as well. Because if we're interviewing developers about their work, and now suddenly so many studios we've covered globally over the past year. I've, you know, heard there was all the stuff from NetherRealm, Mortal Kombat. We just did a Mortal Kombat series. I get emails from people at studios. I mean, CD Projekt, when we did a 6-part series on, there's stories about the amount of crunch that goes on there. There's, you know, I feel like every studio in some way has had at least a handful of people, and perhaps the entire workforce. We're finishing a documentary on Telltale Games, which is all about how much those folks were working and how talented they were, and how they were, you know, cut loose. 400 people lost their jobs and no severance, and 2 weeks of medical expenses or medical insurance. You know, it's such a big thing that it's, you know, Noclip can't just not, you know, ignore it. Whereas 2.5 years ago, it wasn't really in everyone's view, but like right now it's right here, and we have to confront it, you know.
All right, so Telltale coming down the pike. What else has Noclip got going on?
We're doing an E3 project. We're going.
All right.
You know, yeah, we've been, people have been asking us to do it for years, and I didn't know how to do it, because I didn't just want to like do a thing on how the E3 is run, because then we're just doing marketing for the ESA, which is maybe not a great look at the moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover sort of what it's like attending E3 from the perspective of, you know, exhibitors, media, and also some of the, you know, people who buy tickets now. I guess you can just go as an attendee. And I'm not. We've got a couple of partners hooked up that we're going to be kind of like shadowing. Some people in the press, some people in the games industry are showing off stuff, and we're just gonna, like, me and Jeremy are gonna go down and film a bunch of stuff for the whole week and kind of see what we get, and then turn that into a thing, because like you said, the games industry is changing all the time. This year's E3 with no Sony, EA aren't doing a conference. It's pretty different. So we'll kind of take a snapshot, I guess, of E3 2019 and see if we can give the feeling of attending E3, which so many people around the world who tune in to see what's going on in LA. I remember being in Ireland and staying up until 3 a.m. to watch live streams of the conferences. So many people would love to go and don't get a chance to. So we're going to try and capture some of that magic, maybe, and make a little story out of it.
Cool. And maybe do a F1 podcast while we're down there.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, you're gonna go as well, right?
I think I'll be down there. Yeah, last few years I've gone down, but haven't had a badge or anything. Just hang out, see people.
Because you got your family around the area, right?
That's right.
That's cool. Yeah, I'm at the stage now where I have an Airbnb that I get every year that's really cost effective and really nice. So every year I'm I have to make sure I go again because we can get that spot. But every year I've gone for the past few years, it's been mostly business meetings, which have all worked out. But this year I feel like we're gonna actually kind of hit it pretty hard. So yeah, I'll try and make room. What is it? Canada? It's always on.
Yeah,
over there.
It's either pre or post Canada.
Yeah. Our lives are just dominated by games of every variety.
Yes. Competition, sports, etc. So where can people find you and Noclip?
At Danny O'Dwyer on stuff. There's not that many people who have my name, so I'm usually the first one you hit. And then Noclip Video on YouTube is our documentary channel, and we also have Noclip Podcast, but it's kind of it's on iTunes and stuff, but the YouTube channel is just like a little archive for all those ones. And there's not that many of them, but we do them every now and again. Cool.
Well, Danny, thank you very much for talking with me, and I'll see you on Shift F1.
Yeah. See you soon, Drew. Thanks for having me.